This face, it's probably one of the most famous on the entire planet. But while the image is absolutely everywhere, the true story of how it was created is understood by almost no one. So today, we're going to dig into the making of the Che Guevara myth.
Oh yeah, you know this image. It's on posters in dorm rooms, tattooed on arms, and printed on millions and millions of t-shirts. I mean, it's become this universal shorthand for rebellion, revolution, and defiance, right? But it makes you wonder, right? How does a real person, Ernesto Guevara, morph into Che, this global brand? How do you become a commercial product? Let's break it down.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. We'll start with the man himself before the myth. Then we'll look at his death, which is a huge turning point, the actual recipe that created the icon, and then, finally, the product that's still with us today.
All right, first things first. To really get what's going on, you have to separate the person from the poster. So who was the real Ernesto Guevara before he became this legendary Che?
Well, right off the bat, the historical record tells a pretty different story from the legend we all know. Contrary to the myth, he wasn't the main leader of the Cuban Revolution. He was actually an Argentine from a pretty well-off family, and after the revolution's success, he ended up in a series of, well, bureaucratic jobs.
Yeah, so in the new Cuban government, his life wasn't all about being a guerrilla fighter out in the jungle, not by a long shot. He was handed these jobs that, by some accounts, he got pretty tired of. I mean, from overseeing purges at a prison to literally running the national bank and being Minister of Industries. It's a complex administrative reality that's just miles away from that simple, pure, revolutionary image,
Okay, so if his life was a lot more complicated than the myth lets on, what was the big turning point? What was the catalyst? Well, the really crucial moment came not during his life, but right at the very end of it.
Right here. His capture and execution in Bolivia back in 1967, he was only 39 years old. That was the absolute key. See, the analysis we're digging into argues that his death was just essential. It basically froze him in time. It allowed the complex, sometimes contradictory, real person to be sort of erased, leaving this perfect blank canvas for a new legend to be.
He stopped being a flesh and blood person, with his own successes and failures, his good sides and his bad. Once the man himself was gone, the real work of building the myth could begin.
But look, a myth this huge doesn't just pop up out of nowhere. The argument here is that it was built from a very specific recipe. 3 key ingredients that all came together at the absolute perfect moment in history. So what are they? First, a fading revolution needed some fresh blood. Second, a new generation needed a new face. And third, a cynical age needed an idealist. Let's unpack how this perfect storm came together. Okay, ingredient number 1. The Cuban Revolution itself needed a shot in the arm. By '67, the shine was wearing off. The harsh realities of the regime were starting to show, and it needed what this analysis calls fresh martyr's blood to get a new generation excited and on board. Next up, ingredient 2. The timing was just perfect. A year later, it's 1968. And you've got student protest movements exploding all over the world. And this new generation of rebels, they completely rejected the old guard of communism, the stuffy old Soviet bureaucrats. Che was the perfect alternative. He was young, he was handsome, he just seemed to capture that anti-establishment spirit of the times. And that was the whole key right there. He wasn't some figure from a history book. He was of the moment. He looked the part for a new generation that was desperately searching for its own heroes, not the ones their parents had. And for the final ingredient. As we get into the 1970s, the whole idea of the Soviet paradise was really starting to crack. You had stories of shortages, censorship, oppression. It was tarnishing the image of real socialism. And in the middle of all this disillusionment, people were looking for a pure revolutionary figure. And Che? Well, since he died before he could really be blamed for any of the system's failings, he was presented as this untarnished ideal, young, uncompromising, idealistic. So, you've got the recipe, you've got a need for a martyr, a youth movement searching for a face, and a failing ideology in need of a hero. The myth of Che was ready to be cooked up. Now let's look at how this new icon was packaged and basically sold to the world. Yeah, creating this product involved some, let's call it, very careful editing of his life story. The inconvenient bits, like his upper-class childhood or his time as a government bureaucrat, yeah, those were pretty much removed.
Instead, the spotlight was put squarely on his rebellious youth and his time as a guerrilla fighter. It created a much cleaner, simpler, and frankly, a much more marketable story.
And what you get is this curated version of a man, a blank slate, really. He could be shaped into whatever symbol anyone needed him to be. He became this super flexible icon. Some called him a Democrat, others a libertarian, and in what has to be the biggest contradiction of his violent life, some even called him a pacifist. So the result, as the source material puts it, is a prefabricated product. It's an ideological pastiche. Basically, he became a commodity, an idea that could be made to order for any consumer, ready to be slapped onto any cause that needed a cool symbol of rebellion.
And that brings us right back to where we started, doesn't it? That's why this face is still so powerful. Not really as a historical figure you study, but as a consumer good, an image you can easily buy, sell, and wear on a t-shirt.
So, to wrap up the core argument here, the man, Ernesto Guevara, with all his complexities and contradictions, is pretty much gone. But the product, Che, is as powerful as it's ever been.
And this really leaves us with a final, big question to think about. When we embrace an icon, and it doesn't matter if it's Che or someone else, what are we actually embracing? And maybe more importantly, what parts of their real story, the complexities, the truths, the contradictions, what parts are we all just agreeing to forget?